A child's backpack should contain simple things. It might hold a half-eaten snack, a juice box growing warm, a collection of unusually smooth rocks, or a favorite small toy with worn-off paint. These are the artifacts of a day spent exploring, of childhood curiosity, contained within colorful nylon and plastic buckles. A child's backpack should never be a tomb, a time capsule of an unspeakable crime. It should not be found 4 years after its owner vanished, buried under the gnarled roots of an ancient tree. Its contents a curated collection of horror designed to reopen a wound that had never truly healed. The story of 7-year-old Lily Anderson began as a happy memory in the making and ended as a chilling piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered among hikers in the Great Smoky Mountains. She vanished on a bright autumn afternoon from a popular, well-traveled trail. Disappearing in the handful of seconds her parents' eyes were turned away. For years, her absence was a void, a question mark that hung over the misty peaks and dense forests. Then, 2 hikers, miles from where she was last seen, stumbled upon her faded pink backpack. What they found inside transformed a tragic mystery into a grotesque puzzle, suggesting Lily hadn't just gotten lost. She had been taken, and her final moments had been violent. Lily was a whirlwind of bright energy, a girl with hair the color of corn silk that was perpetually escaping its braids, and eyes the deep blue of a summer sky just after sunset. At 7 years old, she possessed an insatiable curiosity about the world, asking questions that often left her parents, Mark and Sarah Anderson, both amused and stumped. She was their firstborn, followed by a younger brother, Thomas, who was 5. They were an ordinary family from Knoxville, Tennessee, who valued their weekends together, often escaping the city for the natural splendor of the nearby national park. They were not hardened adventurers or survivalists. They were a family with a minivan, a cooler full of sandwiches, and a love for the simple joy of being outdoors. The plan for that Saturday in October was simple, almost mundane in its wholesomeness. They chose the Laurel Falls Trail, one of the most popular and accessible hikes in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It was a paved, relatively short path, just over a mile to a beautiful 2-tiered waterfall, a perfect excursion for a family with young children. They had done the hike before. They knew its gentle inclines and its wide, safe walkways. There was no sense of impending danger, no premonition of the tragedy that was about to unfold. It was just a family outing on a perfect fall day. The air was crisp, carrying the sweet, earthy scent of decaying leaves. The forest canopy was a brilliant tapestry of gold, orange, and fiery red, and the sunlight filtered through it in dappled patterns on the trail ahead. Mark and Sarah walked hand in hand, with 5-year-old Thomas between them. Lily, as usual, was a few paces ahead, her pink jacket a vibrant splash of color against the autumn landscape. The last conversation they had with her was utterly forgettable, the kind of parental instruction repeated 1,000 times. Sarah had called out for Lily not to get too far ahead, to stay where they could see her. Lily had turned, a wide grin on her face, and shouted back that she would, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet woods. She then skipped around a gentle bend in the trail, just 20 yards ahead. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park is a place of profound and deceptive beauty. It covers over 800 square miles of dense, ancient forest, a sprawling wilderness of soaring peaks and deep, shadowed valleys. It is the most visited national park in the United States, yet 95% of it is forested and largely untouched by modern development. The weather can change in an instant, with the park's signature smoky fog rolling in to reduce visibility to mere feet. Trails are clearly marked, but just a few steps off the path, the undergrowth becomes a tangled, impenetrable wall of rhododendron and mountain laurel. It is a landscape that is both inviting and infinitely capable of swallowing a person without a trace. Mark and Sarah rounded the same bend in the trail Lily had disappeared behind not more than 30 seconds later. The path ahead was empty. They expected to see her just a little further on, perhaps examining a beetle on a leaf or tracing the patterns in a patch of moss. But she was not there. Mark called her name, his voice calm at first, tinged with a father's mild annoyance. "Lily!" We said not to run off. The only reply was the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant chirping of a bird. A flicker of unease sparked within Sarah. She called out too, her voice a little higher, a little more urgent. They walked faster, their pace quickening with each unanswered call. Panic began to creep in, cold and sharp. This was a paved trail, bordered on one side by a steep, wooded incline and on the other by a sharp drop-off. There were few places for a child to go. They scanned the trees, the underbrush, their hearts beginning to pound in their chests. It had been seconds, a minute at most. How could she have vanished so completely, so quickly? The initial logical explanations that she was hiding, that she had tripped and fallen just out of sight, began to fray, replaced by a primal, sickening fear. After 10 minutes of frantic searching and calling her name with increasing desperation, the reality of the situation crashed down on them. They were on a crowded trail. Other hikers passed by, offering concerned looks. Mark, his face pale, told Sarah to stay put with Thomas while he ran back to the trailhead to get help. The beautiful autumn day had curdled into a nightmare. The vibrant colors of the forest now seemed menacing, the shadows deeper and more sinister. Every rustle of a squirrel in the leaves sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper a name that was not their daughter's. The alarm was officially raised, and the clock began to tick on the most agonizing weight of their lives. The response was immediate and massive. National Park Service rangers were on the scene within the hour, establishing a command post at the Laurel Falls trailhead. They were quickly joined by deputies from the Sevier County Sheriff's Office and teams of volunteers from local search and rescue organizations. The initial search focused on the trail itself and the immediate vicinity. Teams of trained searchers moved in tight lines, shoulder to shoulder, scouring the dense undergrowth on either side of the paved path. The sun began to set, and the search continued under the cold, bright glare of floodlights, the beams cutting eerie swaths through the darkness. The operation grew with each passing hour. By the next morning, it had become one of the largest search efforts in the park's history. Canine units were brought in, their handlers giving the dogs pieces of Lily's clothing to scent, but the sheer number of people who had been on the trail that day made it difficult for the dogs to isolate a clear track. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their pilots scanning the vast sea of trees, their efforts hampered by the thick canopy. Thermal imaging cameras were used at night, searching for the small heat signature of a lost child, but the forest floor was a mosaic of warm and cool spots created by rocks, animals, and decaying matter. The search was a monumental undertaking against an unforgiving wilderness. Investigators pursued every possible theory. The most probable, and the one everyone clung to with desperate hope, was that Lily had simply wandered off the trail. Perhaps she had followed a deer or a rabbit and become disoriented. In this scenario, she was likely scared and hiding, or possibly injured from a fall. Teams focused on drainages, caves, and rock outcroppings, places a small child might seek shelter. But as days turned into a week, this theory became less and less tenable. The search area expanded, radiating outwards in a grid that eventually covered dozens of square miles. Yet not a single clue was found. Not a footprint, not a dropped barrette, not a scrap of her pink jacket. It was as if she had been erased. They considered other possibilities, each more painful than the last. An animal attack was a remote but not impossible scenario in the Smokies, which were home to a healthy population of black bears. However, park biologists found no evidence of a struggle, no blood, and no signs of a predator in the immediate area. The theory that the parents were somehow involved was quickly and quietly dismissed. Mark and Sarah Anderson were subjected to grueling interviews, their home and car searched, their finances examined. They were family transparent in their grief, their agony palpable to even the most cynical detective. There was no secret life, no motive. There was only devastation. The darkest theory, abduction, lingered in the background. It seemed unlikely. A stranger snatching a child from a busy trail in broad daylight, in a window of mere seconds, without anyone seeing a thing, felt like something out of a movie. It would require an incredible amount of luck, precision, and malevolence. But as the search yielded nothing, the impossible began to seem plausible. Investigators started pulling records of all known sex offenders in the region, interviewing anyone with a relevant criminal history, but it was a vast and frustrating net to cast. Without a witness or a piece of evidence, it was just another dead end. The active search was officially scaled back after 2 weeks. The full-time command post was dismantled, and the hundreds of volunteers returned to their normal lives, haunted by the image of a little girl's smiling face on a missing poster. Rangers and small teams continued to conduct targeted searches for months, following up on tips from hikers and psychics. But the trail was cold. The media attention faded. The story of the lost girl in the Smokies became a somber footnote, a local tragedy that people recalled with a shake of their heads whenever they drove past the Laurel Falls trailhead. For Mark and Sarah Anderson, life stopped. They remained in a state of suspended agony, trapped between a sliver of hope and a universe of despair. 4 years passed. The world moved on. But for the Anderson family, time had frozen on that October afternoon. The case file for Lily Anderson sat on a detective's shelf, thick with maps, reports, and dead-end leads. It was officially a cold case, a source of quiet frustration for the law enforcement officers who had poured thousands of hours into the search. The park itself seemed to have absorbed the tragedy. More warning signs were installed at trailheads, cautioning parents to keep their children close. The story became a ghost story, a warning about the dangers that lurk just off the path. The forest kept its secrets, and the silence was absolute. Then, on a warm spring afternoon almost 4 years to the day after Lily disappeared, 2 college students from Ohio decided to explore a less traveled part of the park. They were amateur hikers, drawn by the promise of solitude, away from the more crowded trails. They drove their car down a gravel service road and set off on an unmarked path, a faint trail used mostly by park rangers and the occasional adventurous local. They hiked for several hours, deep into a section of the park miles away from Laurel Falls, in a completely different drainage basin. They were in a remote area that had never been part of the original search grid. Tired and thirsty, the couple stopped to rest under the sprawling branches of a massive, ancient tulip poplar. As one of them leaned back against the trunk, his hand brushed against something buried in the thick layer of leaf litter and soil that had accumulated around the base of the tree. It felt like fabric. Curious, he dug away the damp earth and leaves. A corner of faded pink nylon emerged. He pulled at it, and with a soft tearing sound, a small backpack came free from the tangle of roots that had partially grown over it. It was a child's backpack, pink with a cartoon unicorn on the front, its colors muted by years of exposure to the elements. The hikers felt a chill despite the warm air. They knew the stories. Everyone in the region knew about the little girl who had vanished. They hesitated, a sense of dread washing over them. With trembling hands, one of them slowly unzipped the main compartment. The zipper was stiff and corroded, but it eventually gave way. The smell that emerged was musty and old, the smell of decay and damp earth. Inside, things were arranged with a strange and disturbing neatness. On top lay a child's jacket, the same pink as the backpack, folded tightly into a small square. Beneath it was a single small hiking boot, caked in mud but otherwise intact. But it was the final item that turned their dread into sheer horror. Tucked into the corner of the backpack was a clear plastic sandwich bag, yellowed with age. Inside the bag, nestled on a bed of what looked like dried moss, was a small, delicate, off-white bone. It was strangely shaped, like a tiny wishbone. Alongside it lay a piece of paper folded into a neat square. The hikers backed away from the bag, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. They knew, with a certainty that made them feel sick, that they had just stumbled into the middle of Lily Anderson's nightmare. They left everything as it was, marked the location on their phone's GPS, and scrambled back to their car to call the police. The discovery of the backpack blew the cold case wide open. The Sevier County Sheriff's Office and the FBI immediately took over, securing the location where the bag was found. The contents were sent to the FBI's forensic laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, for analysis. The news broke, and Lily Anderson was once again on the front page, her smiling school picture now juxtaposed with images of investigators combing through a remote section of the forest. For Mark and Sarah, the news was a fresh hell, a violent reopening of a wound that had scarred over but never healed. The discovery of the backpack was a concrete link to their daughter, but its contents promised only darkness. The forensic results came back within weeks, and they were devastating. DNA testing confirmed that the jacket and the boot belonged to Lily. More importantly, the small, U-shaped bone was identified by a forensic anthropologist as a human hyoid bone, consistent with that of a child between the ages of 6 and 8. A microscopic examination of the bone revealed a small hairline fracture. A fractured hyoid bone is an exceptionally rare injury from an accidental fall. In the overwhelming majority of cases, it is a hallmark of manual strangulation or hanging. The case was officially and unequivocally reclassified. Lily Anderson had not gotten lost. She was murdered. With the cause of death now chillingly clear, the investigative focus pivoted entirely. The question was no longer what happened to Lily, but who had done it. The most critical piece of evidence was the piece of paper found in the backpack. When forensic analysts carefully unfolded the brittle document, they found a hand-drawn map. It was crude, sketched in pencil, depicting a series of creeks and ridges. In one corner of the map, there was a small, hand-drawn symbol marking a specific location. A circle with a jagged line, like a lightning bolt running through it. This was not a random doodle. It was a destination. Detectives and park rangers began the painstaking process of trying to align the crude drawing with actual topographical maps of the park. The area where the backpack was found provided a general starting point. They cross-referenced the drawing with old property surveys, logging routes, and historical maps of the region, looking for any landmark that might correspond to the creeks and ridges on the paper. After weeks of analysis, an older ranger recognized a combination of landmarks. The map depicted a remote tract of private land that bordered the national park, an area known locally as Harker's Hollow. It was an old, forgotten piece of property that had been in the same family for generations. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when an investigator, reviewing old aerial photographs of the property from a decade prior, spotted the symbol from the map. Carved into the main gatepost of the long overgrown driveway leading to the property was a circle with a jagged line through it. It was the owner's personal mark, a symbol his family had used for over a century. The property belonged to a man named Silas Blackwood, an elderly recluse in his late 70s. A background check revealed a man who lived almost completely off the grid. He had no credit cards, no cell phone, and rarely left his property. He had a few minor charges from decades ago, one for threatening a census worker with a shotgun, another for a dispute with a neighbor over a property line. He was known in the nearest small town as a paranoid, hostile loner who hated outsiders, especially tourists. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was compelling enough. The map, created by the killer, led directly to Silas Blackwood's property. He fit the profile of a territorial, potentially violent individual who lived in seclusion adjacent to the park. Investigators obtained a search warrant for his property. On a cool morning, a convoy of vehicles from the sheriff's office and the FBI drove down the same gravel roads the hikers had used, then turned onto the barely visible driveway that led to Harker's Hollow. They cut the chain on the rusted gate, passing the post with the ominous carved symbol. They were entering the monster's lair. The property was a scene of profound neglect and isolation. The driveway was almost impassable, choked with weeds and fallen branches. It opened into a small clearing where a dilapidated, unpainted cabin stood, its windows boarded up, its porch sagging. The yard was a chaotic mess of junk, rusted farm equipment, stacks of rotting firewood, and decades of accumulated trash. It was as if time had stopped here 30 years ago. The team of officers, clad in tactical gear, approached the cabin cautiously, announcing their presence. There was no response. They breached the door and entered into a world of darkness and dust. The inside of the cabin was even more cluttered than the outside. Every surface was covered in a thick layer of grime. The air was stale and heavy with the smell of wood smoke and decay. Silas Blackwood was found sitting in a rocking chair in the main room, a shotgun across his lap, staring blankly at the wall. He was frail and thin, a ghost of a man, and he offered no resistance as officers took the weapon and placed him in handcuffs. He seemed more confused than surprised, as if he had been waiting for this day for a long time. While he was secured, the search team began their meticulous work, picking through the detritus of a lifetime of paranoia and solitude. They did not have to look for long. In a small, dust-covered wooden chest in the corner of the bedroom, underneath a pile of yellowed newspapers, an investigator found it. A single small child's hiking boot, a perfect match to the one found in the backpack. Tucked inside the boot was a small, faded pink ribbon tied in a bow. It was the final, damning piece of evidence. It was the ribbon Sarah Anderson had tearfully described to investigators 4 years earlier, the one she had tied into Lily's hair that morning. They had found their trophy, the killer's keepsake. In another room, they found stacks of journals filled with rambling, paranoid entries about the invaders and trespassers who defiled his woods with their noise and their presence. At the sheriff's office, Silas Blackwood sat in a sterile interrogation room, a stark contrast to the chaotic filth of his home. At first, he was silent, his gaze distant and unfocused. The lead detective, a veteran who had been on the case from the very first day, began to speak. He did not yell or threaten. He calmly and methodically laid out the evidence on the table between them. He started with the backpack, then the jacket, the boot. He showed him a photograph of the hyoid bone. He placed a hand-drawn map on the table, followed by a picture of the gatepost with a matching symbol. Finally, he took the second boot and the small pink ribbon out of an evidence bag and set them down. Silas stared at the pink ribbon for a long time. A flicker of something crossed his face, not remorse, but perhaps memory. He began to talk, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. He confessed to everything. His account was delivered with a chilling detachment, a complete absence of emotion. He said he had been out walking the edge of his property that day when he saw the family on the trail below. He watched them, his anger simmering at their intrusion. He saw the little girl, a bright spot of pink, skip ahead of her parents. On impulse, he had stepped out from behind a tree and beckoned to her. telling her he had something to show her, a baby deer hidden in the woods. Lily, with her innocent curiosity, had followed him. He led her away from the trail, deeper and deeper into the forest, across a creek and onto his property. She began to get scared, realizing how far she was from her parents. She started to cry, asking to go back. Her cries, he said, grew louder. He panicked. He was afraid someone would hear her, that his sanctuary would be discovered. He told the detectives, in a flat, monotone voice, that he had put his hand over her mouth to quiet her, and then his hands had gone to her throat. He just wanted her to be quiet. When she was, he carried her body further onto his land and buried her in a place he had prepared long ago for his own passing. The motive was as senseless as it was evil. There was no complex psychopathy, no ritualistic urge. It was the banal, petty evil of a man consumed by territorial rage and a hatred for the outside world. Lily Anderson was not a person to him. She was a symbol, a trespasser who had crossed an invisible line into his kingdom. Years later, he said, he grew bored. The secret had lost its power. He dug up her backpack, placed the folded jacket and one of the boots inside. As a final cruel flourish, he returned to her shallow grave, retrieved the hyoid bone, and placed it in the plastic bag. He then hiked to a different part of the park and left the backpack where it would eventually be found. A final, contemptuous message to the world he despised. He refused, however, to ever reveal the location of Lily's body. It was the one piece of control he had left. Silas Blackwood was charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping. Faced with his own detailed confession and the mountain of physical evidence, his court-appointed lawyer advised him to plead guilty to avoid a trial and a potential death sentence. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, condemned to live out his remaining days in a concrete cell, a world far smaller and more constrained than the forest kingdom he had killed to protect. He died in prison 2 years later from natural causes, taking the secret of Lily's final resting place with him to his grave. The case of Lily Anderson was officially closed, but for her family, there was no closure. Justice had been served, but it was a cold and incomplete comfort. They had found the man who took their daughter, but they never got to bring her home. The mystery was solved, but the pain remained, a permanent fixture in their lives. The great Smoky Mountains still stand, their ancient peaks shrouded in mist, their beauty undiminished. But for those who know the story, the shadows between the trees seem a little deeper now, a somber reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not creatures of myth or legend. They are men, hidden in plain sight, their hearts filled with a darkness more vast and unforgiving than any wilderness.